You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
Welcome to the ECF Staffroom. I'm Elaine Long.
And I am Mark Quinn.
We are programme leaders for the UCL Early Career Teacher Development Programme. Why are we in the staff room? We are here because this is where the best professional learning conversations always take place. This is where problems can be aired bluntly and where solutions can be explored.
Over the course of this series, we will hear the voices of different colleagues as they come into the ECF staff room. We will hear from early career teachers themselves and from the mentors and induction tutors who support them. We will talk about all things ECF, the challenges and the joys. So why don't you enjoy a coffee with us, perhaps even grab a biscuit and sit down to half an hour of ECF staff room chat. Welcome to the ECF staff room, Dr. Rebecca Gordon. We're really excited that you come and joined us in our staff room, Rebecca. You've been busy at a conference, I know. You're going to tell us about that a little bit later, I hope. But you're in our staff room now, so you get to sit down with a cup of something wet. Do you want a cup of tea, a cup of coffee? What would you like?
Well, as it's afternoon, cup of tea, but I don't drink normal tea. I can't stand normal tea. So it would have to be the chamomile or lemon and ginger or berry or something like that.
We have a whole cupboard devoted to specialist teas in this staff room, Rebecca.
Excellent.
Do you drink this with a biscuit, or can I offer you one of those?
Yes, I don't have biscuits in the house because if I have them in the house, I'll eat them all because absolutely biscuits are my weakness. But if you have a custard cream, I'll take one.
Everyone likes a custard cream. We always have a custard cream. I'll get that ready while Elaine gets the proper chat started.
Oh, great choice. A custard cream. You can't go wrong with that. We're really excited to have you in the staff room, particularly as the topic you're going to be talking about, I think, is a topic that people really want to hear about from an expert such as yourself. But your job, I'm sure, is very complex, and it might feel a bit alien to some of us mere mortals. So please, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what your job is like on a day-to-day basis and what you enjoy about it?
Well, no one day is the same, that's for sure. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Human Development at UCL. I run my own research lab, which looks at motor and executive control in children and adults and how they interact and how they explain or might explain educational outcomes, higher order cognitive abilities generally, and also how they might be related to certain abilities and behaviours in children with special educational needs and difficulties. So what else do I do? I like on a daily basis. I mean, I teach as well. I have PhD students. I have master's students who I supervise their dissertation. In terms of my research, which also obviously encompasses what my PhD students do, there's three key areas. One is, and we probably will get into these, one is working memory or working memory executive function, sort of overlapping concepts, but people call them different things depending on which discipline you come from. And I also look at dyslexia, but I don't look at reading and writing. I look at the broader cognitive deficits. And what we're trying to do is find out why these broader cognitive deficits exist and why they might manifest in basically a social invention, an invention by humans, which is reading and writing, and not always in other abilities, that there's a lot of comorbidity. And the other thing, which is probably most relevant to you, is the role of educational neuroscience in the classroom. And that does require unpacking, because it sounds like test tubes in the classroom and, blood samples and genetics, and that's not what it is, but I'm sure we'll get to that. And on a day-to-day basis, I could be marking, I could be at a conference, I could be teaching, I could be meeting with PhD students, I could be having meetings with people about impact and engagement, because I'm head of impact and engagement. I could be on a UNESCO working group. It's different every day, as is the life of an academic, which I'm sure you understand.
And Rebecca, can I ask, why did you decide to specialise in this area?
That's a good question. I think it was when I was doing my master's, I really liked the set of lectures on memory and attention, executive function, working memory. So I thought, well, that interests me. I'll do my dissertation on that. And it was really interesting. And what I did was I developed a non-immersive virtual reality program to test children's higher order abilities, but I'm doing air quotes, because it's not really a real life environment, because it's non-immersive VR, but in a sort of a real life scenario. So they had to set the house up for a birthday party, and it just tested their ability to plan and prioritize, and all these abilities that we associate with executive function or higher order thought. So anyway, so I really enjoyed that. So when I was doing my PhD, I thought, well, I will look for executive function scholars and do my PhD with them, and it led from there, really. And then, of course, that connects very well to how we understand how children learn in the classroom, because those abilities are very important to learning, which we might get to, and the dyslexia stuff, of course, looking at people who have deficits in these areas. So that's how I got to it. I just think it's very interesting, and I think in part it's because we don't. It's a very complex concept, and when we don't fully understand it, it's not sort of a cut and dried concept. We know what it is. That's it. Let's use it. So it's a continuous field of investigation.
Right. That means that my question, I already know what you're going to say, because the question is, you mentioned that educational neuroscience is one of your big things. Well, I want to know, when you use those words, what do those words actually mean? Because I think we trip them up. We trip out this phrase. Those of us who are not experts in this field, we trip out the phrase, educational neuroscience, as if we knew what it was. So can you help us here? What is it and what isn't it, maybe?
Yeah, I think it is a bit misleading as a term. And if you were in the US, they would call it mind-brain education. Because it's about how we think, how the brain works, and how that applies to education. Other people would call it the science of learning, or the learning sciences. So it is about how we as human beings learn, and it's incredibly complex, because what that sounds like is like it's a one-way process. We receive some information and we learn from it, but it's not. It's much more complicated than that. But it's about those different systems and processes, such as attention, memory, spatial awareness, spatial reasoning, causal cognition, all these different concepts that we have, neurobiologically, they're systems that we have, and that, of course, have evolved. We've evolved to have them for specific reasons, but now we have this formalized learning. So how does it work in those environments? And understanding that is important, because it can help not just teachers, but also the children themselves. As children get older and become more aware of these processes, we look at things like metacognition, so understanding how they themselves learn, but also, in terms of how policy is developed and how it informs schools and teachers and teaching content. So it is an important area, but yes, calling it educational neuroscience, at some point that term would have been the right term, but it can be misleading. I do understand that. But that's basically what it is, using developmental psychology, neuroscience and education to promote better learning and promote better teaching.
Yeah, it's well, listening to that answer and the breadth of that answer, it sort of strikes me that forgive me, it's almost a problem, isn't it? Because it's so expansive. There's so much which falls within the sphere of learning sciences, educational neuroscience. Is that problematic for you as an academic in the field, or someone who might seek to because you're interested in impact and engagement with the research? Is it problematic that that field is so enormous?
I don't think so, because I think any field is enormous, and that's why it's so important to have things like the Centre for Educational Neuroscience that I'm part of. It's important to have things like the International Conference in Working Memory, which is the conference I was just at. It's very important to have these things because nobody can know everything, and it brings everybody together so you can share the knowledge and make those connections and see where the overlaps are. And that's how different concepts build. I was talking to some people at the conference I was just at that one person was looking at spatial working memory and creativity. And I was saying, I've got a PhD student who's looking at spatial working memory and mind wandering and how that might relate to creativity. And so we started having a conversation about that. And then she mentioned other scholars that are looking at overlapping things. And then you sort of build a network, and that's how you better understand things. So it's not problematic that it's so huge, but it would be problematic if we didn't have those platforms on which to discuss the different areas.
And I guess problematic if anyone claims to be an expert in it all, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely. You can't be an expert in all of this.
So beware that person
start,
who,
you would have to be about 300 years old to be an expert in all of it. But also you would have to be 300 years old, like immediately at the points of time in which you're discussing these concepts, because they're constantly evolving.
Right.
So that's why you have fairly narrow experts in certain fields, because they understand where the gaps are in the research, where these unsolved sort of conundrums exist, and how they should be tackled and how they are being tackled, and sort of take that journey with the research. So it's not a static thing. So you can't just know it.
So that brings me nicely on to my next question, because it's fair to say over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been an increased interest in cognitive science. Teachers are reading about it more than ever, and it's quite ubiquitous on professional learning programmes. And it has also influenced policy, particularly in England, regarding teaching and learning and professional development. So a couple of questions for you, really. Do you welcome this interest, and what do you see as the opportunities and limitations of this trend?
We absolutely 100% welcome it. We have every week in the Centre for Educational Neuroscience an online seminar where we get education professionals, policymakers, other academics come along, and we can draw quite big crowds, and where we present research in the field. And we want teachers to be interested in this, and seeing the growth of teachers being interested in it is fantastic. And that is what led indirectly to the early career framework, because teachers wanted to know more about it. And then, via the DFE, this came back down, and I worked on that. Actually, with only a little bit. I did a little bit. I know Mark was much more involved, but we absolutely welcome it. And I mean, I can't say enough how much we encourage engagement in this stuff. In terms of limitations, I mean, it's not really limitations, but it's things to be wary of. So one of it's not a limitation, but it's an area to be cautious that you don't make this content prescriptive. So you're not telling teachers how to teach, because there's a big difference between evidence-based practice and evidence-informed practice. Because what we want from educational neuroscience is for teachers to understand how this research comes about and how it's evaluated and what good research looks like, so that they can have that knowledge and they can look at sort of proposals as to how teaching might be done and understand whether that's robust, whether that's valid, and whether it isn't, and then use that to inform their own practice, because they are teachers. I'm not a teacher. I've never been a teacher. I don't know how to teach. I've been in schools and thought, how do you do that? My goodness, how do you control 37-year-old children at the same time? So we don't want to tell them how to teach. We just want them to understand the evidence. And I think that that's what's important. And in that way, you avoid application of things that are not robust and are not evidence-based. I know that schools, they have two very valuable resources. One is time and one is money. And when I see schools, with all the good intentions, all the right intentions, using practices that have cost them money and are taking the teachers' time, and they're not evidence-based. And just, you wouldn't even have to test them. You can sort of see that they're hooey just by looking at them. Now, I see some great stuff happening in schools, but I also see some things that I just think, oh, well, that's a shame. And just while we're on it, just on having teachers understand how this research comes about and how it's evaluated, is often you will see interventions in schools, good interventions, for literacy or for behaviour or whatever. And it would be really, really good if the teachers could evaluate the effectiveness of it. So they might observe that literacy has improved. They might observe that behaviour has improved. It would be great if they actually did evaluation of it. Now, I understand they don't have much time, but just to say this was, for example, their reading ability before the intervention, and this was their reading ability after the intervention. That would be very useful for them, but also very useful for other people. But sorry, that was quite a long, I can't even remember the question.
It's super interesting. One of the things I'm just curious about is you mentioned that there are some practices emerging as a result of people engaging with the science of learning that sometimes probably bear less resemblance to the original research itself. Could you give any examples of general things you've seen that you think might be particularly harmful?
I wouldn't say they're emerging. I would say they're enduring. So these are things that have been around for a long time and they keep popping up. And I've written a paper on this with other academics from the centre. And we have actually some video explainers if you want to go on the website. So it's things like learning styles, that there are different types of learning styles, but there aren't different types of learning styles. So there's certainly no evidence that there are. I'm trying to left brain, right brain thinking. That's not a thing. I'm trying to. There are, one of my big things is, and I've done the video explainer on this, is identifying children with dyslexia. So there's this myth that if children, when they're learning to write, if they reverse the letters, so like a B is a D is a B, that's a sign of dyslexia. And it's not. It's just a perfectly normal process of stage of development, because a child doesn't understand that the orientation of the object, that is the letter, completely changes the sound it makes. Because if they pick up a block or a ball or a teddy bear, it doesn't matter which way round it is, it's still that object. But if you turn a D upside down, instead of D, it's P. It's normal. But so it's, and you get yes, you can sort of have people selling themselves as gurus, and they don't know this stuff. It is, and when you have things like Twitter, that this stuff spreads like wildfire, and people follow people and say, oh, this person's an expert, and you look at it, you think they're not. But having said that, there's a lot of experts on Twitter. I'm not saying that they're not. I'm on Twitter.
I mean, in terms of something like, say, cognitive load theory, do you see many sort of, do you see much bad practice emerge as a result of people engaging in that?
Did you see me flinch when you said that? I was in a meeting in a working group the other day, and somebody who wasn't an academic mentioned it, and all the cognitive psychologists on the screen flinched. I mean, cognitive load theory, it's a tricky one because, in its essence, yes, when you're teaching someone, there's only so much content that they can handle, not novel content that they can handle. And if you overload it, they're going to have problems. But the issue with the theory, and I hope that Sweller's not going to listen to this and send me a nasty email, but the issue with the theory is that it assumes that this very static and narrow view of the systems involved in learning are everything there is to say. So it takes one phenomenon that occurs in certain situations, like the one I've just described, and treats it as if that's the fundamental constraint in learning, which is just not true. And it's often conflated with working memory, because working memory is limited and it's effortful and you can't overload it. Which, yes, there are some, this is the thing about cognitive science. Yes, there are some overlaps in the way you describe these abilities, but they're not the same thing, and they're not as simple as they look. So I think I say working memory because what cognitive load theory does is it doesn't, so it talks about some concepts that have come from working memory. So we have this verbal store and we have this visual spatial store, and they're both limited, but you can load one and load the other, and they won't sort of confuse each other. And to a degree, that's true, to a degree, but it depends what the content is. It depends whether the visual spatial information can be verbally recoded. If it can, that's going to cause problems. But the point I was getting to is that it ignores the executive control processes, which is domain general. And that is very limited and effortful. So that can become overloaded. And it doesn't take that into account. It does talk about schemata in long-term memory, and it sort of treats that as if it can do the what shall we do next job, and when should we use this information, but it's not the same thing. So we're talking about a set of cognitive abilities that come together when we're learning, and some are used more than others in different situations. Some can be overloaded, some can't be overloaded. It's very complex. And to just say cognitive load theory is vital in learning it's just much more complex than that. And it's unhelpful to simplify it.
And that's quite hard for a teacher in a classroom, isn't it? Because I think, how can I possibly know the cognitive load of my pupils? Because I used to think as a teacher, well, I don't have a little sort of computer screen window into their brains. I wish I did. And it's interesting because one of the things I've observed as a sort of I guess negative thing emerging from this is that people have interpreted cognitive load theory as the need to minimize cognitive load rather than optimize it. And I think they're two very different things. And I think, optimizing it is thinking about the working memory as limited, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, most people would largely agree on. But it's tricky because how do we really know that? But there are some good practices we can have in the classroom to avoid that. But that doesn't mean we have to minimize everything, because in minimizing everything, a downside or a negative that is can make instruction quite dry and boring. And often people can fall into the trap of minimizing it more than they need to, such as, not having any pictures on the walls, or and often I see sometimes those sorts of policies in schools are justified as a result of cognitive science. And I wonder to what extent someone who's a real expert in cognitive science would agree that theory would really extend that far, because as you said, it's very, very complex. And I imagine that your conference, people are disagreeing about it, perhaps, and perhaps there isn't such a consensus as is presented.
Yeah, I mean, cognitive load theory would never come up in a working memory conference, because it's just, it's not, like I said, the learning processes are much more complex than that. It's can I say it's not even worth talking about, because it's unless we were talking about how it's problematic being used in the schools. But I was going to pick up on two things you said, actually. One, that how can a teacher know about each individual child's cognitive load, which, I mean, I agree, of course they can't. But this is another problem with cognitive load theory, is that it assumes it's teacher-led, and it's not. You know, it's very much about the child as well. It's a two-way process, and cognitive load theory doesn't really include the learner as an agent in that process, more like a recipient that only has so much room. And that's simply not the case. They can actively engage in their learning. But the other thing I was going to say was, you talked about, you know, not having stuff on the walls and removing all other distractors. This removes the very essence of what long-term memory formation is. The role of context in long-term memory formation is vital. And if you look at people who have hippocampal damage and they've lost the ability to form new long-term memories, could be, you know, through some traumatic brain injury, stroke or whatever, what is missing for them is context. And context is used, I mean, there's other things, but context is vital because we use that when we encode information. So I'm not saying so therefore have loads and loads of stuff in the environment, so we've got lots of contextual elements will help us in coding, but to say they're unimportant in a theory is just misses the point entirely, because whenever you encode information, whenever you recall information and then re-encode it, you're connecting it to things in your environment, and if you couldn't do that, you wouldn't be able to form new long-term memories. So I say all this to just indicate how it's more complicated than just saying don't have distractors.
This is so interesting, Rebecca, because as you indicated a little while ago, you are aware of the early career framework and parts of our program and what we say about educational neuroscience, because you helped us write large parts of it.
Small parts.
Yeah. So you are aware of the I guess the seductiveness of simplification, because teachers aren't reading research papers and they're not attending working memory conferences, nor can they really, because they're busy doing their actual job. So maybe mutations start creeping into how they teach because they understand some of aspects of working memory, and that turns into a way of teaching, or it turns into what they do and don't put on their walls or on their PowerPoints, for example. Or so we can without ticking teachers off, we understand that there are good reasons why teachers might fall into a series of traps, just like teachers have always fallen into traps. You mentioned learning styles before, and as a trap that perhaps, you know, some of us old enough might have fallen into when we were teachers. Not me, of course. So we understand that this happens. I wonder if I could sort of, if we're going to leave cognitive load theory to one side, because you say it's not helpful to talk about it much more. So I think that's fair enough. If we could talk a little bit more about actual working memory, which is what you're is one of the fields you're really interested in, and is the conference you were at recently. What would you say would be really helpful for teachers to know about when it comes to working memory? You're not a teacher. They are the teachers, but you're the scientist in this. So what is it really useful for them to know about so that teachers might actually convert that into something useful in the classroom?
Now, that is an interesting question. And we got one of the talks at the conference that I've just been at. The final talk that I saw yesterday was by Sue Gathercole, who you might know. I don't know whether she's a big working memory researcher, but she's kind of the key person for working memory in education. Mm-hmm. She's been doing it for a long time. She's very knowledgeable. And her end message was that we need, and she does this very well, but everybody who's looking at working memory in education should be engaging with schools, because we need to understand how we can provide this information in an accessible way so that it can be used in the classroom. So there's no point me saying working memory as the concurrent processing, storage and manipulation of information in pursuit of a known goal in novel situations. That's the standard description of working memory. And novel situations are obviously learning new material. The known goal is to remember it, and the processing and storage is the learning process. But how you actually use that in the classroom is we need to be talking to teachers, and many people, Sue Gathercole is one of them, Amanda Waterman is another one, are doing this very well. But what happens is that you do it in pockets of schools, so Amanda is in Leeds doing it with schools around there, etc. And to my mind, so I'm sorry, I know I'm not answering your question, but I think that this stuff, not working memory, but educational neuroscience in general, needs to be embedded in ITE. This needs to be part of standard. And I know that we're a long way off that, and it would require influencing policy, etc. But this is another reason why we should be engaging with schools, because we need to understand how they can use the information, what limitations there are, what the challenges are in that this knowledge could address, and then sort of lobbying to get policy changed. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question.
That was one way of answering the question, but I'm going to be a Michelle Hussein for you and give you another opportunity to answer the question by giving you a slightly different prompt, which is, because you mentioned before about your interest in dyslexia and other sort of the broader cognitive deficits. So let's imagine this situation that, a typical classroom will have children in it who have these cognitive deficits, right? Because every classroom does. So every teacher faces this. So what might be really useful for such a teacher to know about from the field of neuroscience, educational neuroscience, if not specifically working memory, that you think this, a young teacher perhaps missed this out in their ITE preparation, but would really is really interested and is aware that they've got pupils in their class who've got these cognitive deficits and they really want to do their best?
I will stick to working memory because we'll be here for a year if I'm talking about educational neuroscience generally.
Sure.
But I think it's important to understand that working memory is vital in the learning process, that it does involve, and the reason it's vital is because it is the processing and storage of information. So it's a focusing of attention of the information that's being received, processing it so that you understand it, and then applying it in some way. So doing a maths sum, for example, learning a new mathematical procedure and doing a maths sum. If children are struggling, if they seem inattentive, if they are always scribbling things down, if they seem to be taking longer to grasp the concept, these could be indications of working memory problems. Right. Now, that's not prescriptive. If they do that, they've got a working memory problem, goodbye. Because working memory problems are linked to a whole range of SEND populations. So dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and it goes on and on and on. It's the part of the brain that is implicated in working memory, which is the prefrontal cortex, does seem to show atypicalities in different populations. So it's not all about limitations, but there's atypicalities. But it is worth noting that those things and others, and I'm happy to send links because there are other people that provide much better indicators than I can in this on that. Worth noting that those could be problems with working memory, and how you help children who might be struggling with working memory, because it doesn't have to be a child with dyslexia, it could be anyone. No. I mean, I'm sure you both know that one of the biggest impediments to learning, one of the biggest challenges to learning in terms of a child's profile, is domestic violence in the home.
Sure.
It really creates the worst learning outcomes. And one of the things that is problematic is obviously children in such situations are either tuning out or are hypervigilant. It's all about among other things, it's very much about the attentional profile, which is what working memory is. It's a type of attention. So there could be a number of reasons why, that's my point, that why a child is having problems with working memory. What you can do is you can give them memory offloading devices. Now, I know that small whiteboards are used a lot in classrooms now, but sometimes lessons are given where it's whiteboards away, we're going to do this a different way, we're going to do like some I'm not sure whether mental arithmetic is still a thing in schools, but there might be a situation. Well, for a child that has limited working memory, that can be very problematic because they were using that as a prompt and they may be completely lost. It may be how the information is delivered. So in small chunks, rather than do this, then do this, then do this, and then come and sit down. So, okay, I want you to do this first, and then I want you to do that. So there's not so much being held in mind and processed and mentally ticked off as it's done, so going through the process mentally. And more time as well, more time to do things, because it can take time to process the information and then manipulate it and then apply it. So there are a lot of very, very good resources out there for this sort of thing, which I'd happily share with you later on. But those are the types of things that teachers should have knowledge of how these processes work, why they're important in working memory, in learning, and what you can do about them. Yeah.
So issues of problems in the attention sphere, if you like, isn't always or necessarily a child not bothering to attend. This is a child who is attending in the way that they can, or very likely in the way that they can, and the teachers can do something about that. They can do it.
It's very rarely because the child doesn't want to pay attention. Well,
Sure.
They might not want to pay attention for a number of reasons, but it's very rarely because they can't be bothered. There's usually another reason.
Or a child might have learned that behavior, of course, that actually not paying attention is a tactic in itself, right?
Exactly.
If they've learned that that's the way they get through their day. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I think I'm glad I gave you a second bite of that question, Rebecca. Thank you.
Well, I'm probably very naively going to ask you another massive question. I'm going to go for it. But you mentioned at your conference that you were talking about the link between working memory and emotion. And I was really interested in the second word, because I think the role of emotions in learning are perhaps talked about less in common discourse around cognitive psychology, at least. So I was fascinated to hear that that's part of your conference, and I just wondered if you could. I mean, I know I'm asking you an incredibly complex question, but for an ECT in their classroom, obviously they're thinking about learning for a cognitive lens, and we've just talked about that. But also, how should they be thinking about learning for an emotional lens as well?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm not an expert in emotion, so I won't go into it in too much, but we do know that socio-emotional factors are just as important in the learning process. So you have your memory, you have attention, and basic, numeracy and language, etc., are all very important, but socio-emotional factors are very important. So social factors are things that can affect you emotionally as well. So, so I'd mentioned domestic violence earlier, but the home environment, I'm not saying always negative, it can be a good thing or a bad thing. You can have a brilliant home environment, or you can have one that's slightly more challenging. But those social factors, environmental factors, really do affect learning, and they affect the cognitive processes. We know as adults, if you're stressed, your working memory shuts down. It doesn't shut down, but it becomes limited. Just like, oh, what was I doing? I can't remember that. I'm going to have to write it down. If you're stressed about something. Well, it's funny actually, because when I arrived at the conference, this was a real visual spatial working memory failure. I'd had problems with parking, which I won't get into, but it involved a lot of trying to find places and walking up and down and yeah. And when I got there, I was late for the first session and I really wanted to see it. So there were only a few. There was probably about 8 name badges on the desk left. And I said, hi, I'm here for the conference. And she said, oh, yes, just pick out your name badge. And I did the scan and I said, it's not there. And she said, well, I'm looking at the list and you're registered, so it should be there. And I wasn't rude, but I said, it's definitely not here. And then she just leant over and pointed to it. There it was, right in front of me. So that's a typical, so I'm stressed, I'm running late, and I had a complete working memory failure where I couldn't process visual information. So there are, so I've forgotten your question because I went off on that. That's
Well, do you
another
know what?
working memory
It's
failure.
a really good analogy. I mean, I sympathise on the parking because I find that very stressful also, and that would send me into working memory failure. But I mean, I was thinking about the classroom because there are many situations in the classroom or many strategies we might use in the classroom that we think are enhancing our students and helping them to think hard about stuff. But in fact, because of the emotional impact we're having on them, I'm thinking about practices like cold call if they're implemented badly. You know, if students are stressed and anxious, it may actually inhibit their thinking process rather than enhance it. And I guess what I'm hearing as you're speaking is that as there are a multitude of factors that can affect a child's ability to think hard in the classroom, what we need to think. And as a teacher, we need to be balancing all of those, the cognitive and the emotional. We need to be thinking about how they're feeling in order to get them to think well. And I think that's a message I hear less in teaching, but I think it's an important message, actually.
I agree. It's very important. And I don't, you said cold calling. I don't think I know what that is in the classroom context.
So cold calling is a common strategy. Some people might know it as targeted questioning, and it can be a really good technique for teachers to use. So if I was in the classroom, rather than just asking a question and letting you put your hand up, I might ask my question so you're all thinking hard about it, and you or Mark won't know who I've asked, and then I'm going to pick on Mark, who looks like he's not listening. But so I guess the cognitive science behind it is it's making everyone think hard in the classroom, whereas if you just ask the people with their hands up, not everyone might be thinking. And there's a danger when you always go to the students that want to answer, you don't know what other students are thinking. A negative side effect, if it's implemented badly, and I know it does work effectively for lots of teachers, is that it can make students feel incredibly nervous. I know as a student myself in the classroom, believe it or not, I was very introverted when I was a pupil, and I would have been very afraid in a classroom if I'd known my teacher was going to pick on me any minute. And the panic of having to answer a question would have made me do exactly what you did at that event. It would have made me say something ridiculous, as I've often done in interviews, actually. And this probably explains why I'm so bad at interviews. I give the most ridiculous answers in interviews, and maybe now I know why it is. But so I just think it's about balancing all those things, and that's very hard for teachers, isn't it? They've got such a hard job.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. There are certain things in teaching that work very well, but just like some adults are introverted, some are shy, some are socially anxious, so are children, and they don't always want to play the game that you're playing. But like I said, I'm not a teacher, but I think that it's fairly simple to understand. A child is shy. Don't cold call them, as you called it. If you know a child is socially anxious, don't make them be the one to stand up and present something. You can ask them and give them the opportunity, but accept that that's just not who they are. And I think that is important to understand, and it is important to understand the emotional aspect of learning, as you said. So maths anxiety is a real problem in Western cultures. You don't tend to get it in Singapore or, China or Taiwan. It's not a concept, but it is in some, other cultures. And it's not nothing to do with ability. Some of the best physicists in the world have maths anxiety. It's true. It's not about ability, and it's not about automatizing, maths facts. Some people really do have this, and it really affects their learning. And that it's just as important as the cognition, because it affects the cognition. Even if it didn't, it would be important. But if you're talking about learning processes, stress, anxiety, all of those things affect. And so does nutrition and hydration.
During this conversation, Rebecca, you've mentioned a number of research academics or papers that might be interesting, or YouTube clips that you've been responsible for, and we will post links to those, with your permission, alongside this podcast when it goes out. We're also aware that you are in the process of constructing a short course, an online short course, I think it is, for teachers with interest in educational neuroscience. Just wondering if you can let us into any tidbits around that, what that might contain, and how teachers might find out about it and get access to it.
Yes, well, it's in the very early stages of development, so I can't tell them about how they would have access to it because that's not formalized yet. But it will involve teaching in an accessible way. You know, we don't expect somebody to be doing a year-long master's in educational neuroscience, but about attention and memory systems and processes rather, and how and why they're important in the learning process, so how they're engaged in different situations, and how and why they might fail in certain situations and in certain populations. And then how that can be used to develop teaching. So what I've said is a very important part of educational neuroscience is that teachers understand how this research is produced. So it'll be talking about how we know what we know. It's to move away from what I call I reckonism, which you can get. You know, some people will put themselves forward as experts, and it's not empirically based evidence. It's I reckon this would be good.
Tell us more about I reckonism. I like that phrase.
Well, I mean, that's basically it. It's when you know, if somebody has an idea that a certain concept or approach might work, but you say, so what's the empirical evidence for that? And there isn't any, or it's misapplied. And so, well, have you actually done some lab-based testing on that? And then have you taken that approach and done a randomized control trial in a learning situation to see whether that approach improves outcomes, whatever that outcome might be, whether it's maths or literacy or some other process. So yes, it's what I would really like to see, and this is why I would encourage teachers to take this course when it's developed, so that you can understand how we know what we know about learning sciences, and being able to evaluate the evidence for yourself. So this isn't about reading research papers, but it's about understanding the basics, so that if somebody comes along and says, oh, look, I've got these coloured lenses that you can put over words and it cures dyslexia, you know, well, actually, I know about this, and that's not how it works.
Well, I reckon that our ECTs and mentors will be really interested in that course. And I also reckon I know how they'll find out about it, because once it does become available, Rebecca, we will make sure that we share links to it through your centre or wherever it might appear, wherever the course appears. We'll share links to it through our own UCL Extend virtual learning environment, because we think it's really, really important, actually. And actually, one of the aspects of the ECF now is research literacy. So I think the last point you made there about how do we know what we know is really important, particularly in this field. So I think that you'll get a lot of takers for that course, Lisa. I hope so.
That would be great, because can I just tell you about some findings from another PhD student who has looked at teachers' understanding of educational neuroscience and the different factors that influence that. Now, what we know works is formalized training. So academics who are experts in that field doing formalized training directly to the teachers. And I say directly to the teachers because what we know doesn't work is when the school sends along one person to do the training and then come back and teach everybody else. That's where misinterpretation comes about. And of course it does. They've done like one day or like 8 weeks of something. So we know that sort of secondary learning doesn't work. We know that CPD often doesn't work for that reason, and also because schools don't always know which CPD programs are valid and which ones aren't. And casual learning, blogs, etc., they don't work. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who's looked at a blog and done some CPD knows nothing about educational neuroscience. But when we assessed, it was more than 800 teachers, and we put them into groups based on whether they do no learning, whether they've done CPD, casual learning, blogs, etc., or formalized training. And then we tested them on neuromyths and neurofacts related to learning. And it was only the group that had done the formalized training that could actually differentiate between them. And the others were significantly worse and believed a lot of neuromyths.
That's fascinating.
Can we give that research student a name check?
Oh, yes, Yatin Arslan. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I went along to his talk, which he was talking about that research that he's been doing. It was really, really fascinating. So maybe we can we should give him a shout out as well. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. He'd love to do a podcast as well, I'm sure.
And we can maybe link to his research paper in the podcast notes as well. And
yes,
people can read it.
There is one in Impact, actually. I'll send you the link.
Right.
Yeah.
And an important lesson there for us all. I know even I've been guilty of this, sort of reading a blog and thinking, oh, that sounds interesting. I might give that a try in my classroom tomorrow. But I guess what you're giving us is a bit of a health warning behind that. And there's a difference between the original research itself and hearing it from academics who are fluent and offer expertise in that, than hearing it from blogs that may be filtered down. But of course, there could be some great blogs out there as well.
Oh, there are. I mean, Jonathan Firth at Strathclyde, he's got a fantastic blog. And he's an academic, he researches that stuff. I think I'm not saying blogs are bad or magazine articles are bad, but do a bit of a name check on who's writing it and where they're from and what their expertise is. Yeah.
Comes back to that research literacy again, I think. Well, I reckon we're coming to the end of the podcast, but it's my favourite question. So, Rebecca, we give every guest a Post-it note. And on that Post-it note, we invite you to write some advice, and you can stick that Post-it note wherever you like. So here is your Post-it note. What would you like to write on it, and where would you like to stick it?
Okay, well, I had two. And I thought one will probably get covered. So whichever one doesn't get covered, I'll make the other one my Post-it. And I think it would be advice to schools. So I would put it in the staff room or in maybe the head teacher's office to get involved with research, get involved with research centres. We want you 100%. So this isn't about giving up 20% of your time. It can be small, but if I'm writing a grant about some research into, how children learn or how teachers can, structure their training, if I could just have you on the advisory committee to sit when we first start to design the grant, and then maybe have a bit of a look at the study design at the end, because we want to know not just what's important, but what would actually work in schools. Would this information be relevant to you? It can be being involved, not necessarily in a grant, but if somebody is putting a study together, so we've already got the money or we don't need the money, being involved on the study design so that we know that this intervention or just this basic data collection process will actually work. And most importantly, impact. What do you need from us? What do you need to know? How can we help you? So I would say, if I got an email from somebody saying, I'm the head teacher at blah, blah primary school, and I'd be really interested in talking to you about your research and how we could get involved, that would be a very good day for me. I would absolutely love it. So that would be my Post-it.
It's a great Post-it note.
Yeah, and the bell is ringing on that head teacher, because I think as they're listening to this podcast, they're about to pick up the phone to you, Rebecca, or fire you an email, because I think you're going to interest quite a lot of head teachers and mentors and early career teachers out there in your work, and they'll gladly engage with you more in your research. At least I hope so. Rebecca, it's been just amazing talking to you. I think we could have had another hour at least. We might have to get you back for part 2.
Absolutely. Well, one just about working memory. I can do that.
Just on working memory.
Yes.
Well, and yeah, so that would be great. We should definitely do that. Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. If you are going to another conference again, maybe you can bring Elaine and me along as well, because I think we would like to sit in the back of that hall and take some notes.
I know we're running out of time, but I am going to IMBES now. I think registration is closed, but do you know the International Mind Brain Education Society Conference?
The stuff that I don't know, it could fill a whole other podcast, Rebecca.
I'll tell you what's fantastic about it. It's neuroscientists, psychologists, and educationalists. So, and it's pitched at all those levels. It's brilliant for teachers. We always get lots of teachers there. So, IMBES, there you go.
Fantastic. That's one for the homework. Rebecca, if we don't let you go now, we'll have too much to do, and we won't be able to get on with our day jobs. So, thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. Thanks. Bye.
Our thanks go to Dr. Rebecca Gordon, Associate Professor at UCL and part of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience Management Committee there, for sharing a ginger and lemon tea with us this week in the ECF staff room.
Please do get in touch with us if you think you would like to chat about your ECF experience. In the meantime, do join us soon for a biscuit and a chat with another colleague in the ECF staff room.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, there's more where that came from. Search IOE podcast from wherever you get your podcasts to find episodes of the ECF staff room, as well as more podcasts from the IOE.
And a quick favour before you go. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show. And that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing what the ECF staff room is all about.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.